So looking at Riot's API, we have summoner data being returned here, but what if we wanted to return a little bit more? Say, for example, league data or their ranked data. Here, Riot provides an API that allows us to take that encrypted summoner ID and fetch more details about a user. Here's my encrypted summoner ID. And if I feed that off to this API, I can get details like this player is Diamond 4 in ranked solo queue and Gold 4 in ranked flex. Let's go ahead and set up an API that actually makes this request from within our code. We could put this in the summoner.js file, but I'm going to create a ranked.js file just because it doesn't hurt to separate our code more. So let's create a ranked details URL. And we're going to take in region and then summoner ID. And then we're going to do something similar to up here. We're just going to take this and put it in place of NA. And we're going to replace this encrypted ID with summoner ID as one of the exports. Now you might be wondering how we're going to get the summoner ID when we make this API call. And the answer is through middleware. We can't expect our end users to know the encrypted summoner ID because that's an unrealistic expectation for 99% of the users. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to use the summoner name. We're going to pass that through some middleware to get summoner ID attached to the request. And then we're going to take that summoner ID on the request to pass it to this request itself to get that detail. So let's go ahead and copy these three from our summoner file since we know we're going to need them. And we might as well include the Axios options as well because that's probably going to be needed as well because it includes our credentials. And let's create a function called getRankedDetail. It's asynchronous and we want to use region and summoner ID to request it from that API. In our summoner file, we had constantDB and yesterday, yada, 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 all this stuff. Let's just go ahead and copy this as a template and edit it rather than having to worry about rewriting it from scratch. So we have our database connection, we have our yesterday defined. Our query probably is going to be pretty similar to this. However, our ranked detail is not going to include summoner name. It's probably going to include summoner ID. And since summoner ID is not something that our users are going to be entering directly, it's something we don't need to worry about creating irregular expressions for. In fact, we probably don't want to get rid of the case sensitivity of it because it is a unique ID. It could be case sensitive. And rather than a summoner document, we're going to return a ranked doc. And then here, instead of pulling it from summoner doc, we're going to pull it from ranked. And we're going to assign it to ranked document, and that should get us any ranked documents that already exist in the DB. Now, of course, there are no ranked documents that already exist in the DB, but once we get to it, this should work just the same. So we're going to again delete query.lastModified. This is so that in the event that when we update a document, we're not only updating documents that were created in the last 24 hours, we're updating any documents in the database that match the rest of the query. Then we're going to define a response, and we're going to do the same thing as the summoner file again. We're just going to get details from an external API. Rather than summoner name, it's get ranked details URL, region, summoner ID, and our Axios options. Now, something important to note is the data that Riot will return is not going to have a single object. It's going to be an array of objects. So I could be ranked in multiple different queues like I am here. So what we need to do is tie it to a singular ID and a singular region so that when we do query it against the database, we can simply query name and region. So we need to ensure that name, region, and last modified are on the document. So let's go ahead and update that data. So let ranked data equal summoner ID, region, and here's where we can add that ranked detail data that we got from Riot, response.data. Now we're going to create an update object like we did before, set. Let's just go back to our summoner and copy all that good jazz stuff. And instead of setting it to response.data, we're setting this to ranked data. Our update options are still upsert, but rather than updating into summoners, we're going to update into ranked, and we're also going to pull it from ranked on top of that. And then we're going to return ranked document. Did we define ranked document anywhere? No, ranked doc. There we go. And that should be defined all the way up here. Perfect. So now let's create a method called lookup ranked detail. That's actually going to be what's added to the route. Takes the request and the response. Let's copy the same thing we did here because, again, I'm very, very lazy. And rather than summoner name, it'd be summoner ID and region. And then summoner ID. And what this will do is it will call get rank detail, and it'll return back the data. So then we're going to do module.exports equals lookup rank detail. And if we call this from our index.js.get ranked, and we have this const ranked equals require services/ranked, anytime we call this API with a rank or with a summoner ID and a region, we should get back the data. So now that we're doing this, we could test to see that this works, and it does. However, something important to note is when I make this request, it's still taking 200 or so milliseconds, which tells me that's probably not pulling it from the MongoDB. I'm going to go ahead and look here, and I notice even though I've got ranked doc pulling from the database, I'm not returning it if it exists here. So I just need to add if ranked doc return ranked doc. And that should solve all of our problems and make it run much faster. Look at that, 44 milliseconds when it was the first time it's connected to the MongoDB. The next time it takes 5 milliseconds. But the one problem we're going to run into is how is a third party going to know what this encrypted summoner ID is? They probably want to be able to just enter summoner name, right? This is where we're going to leverage the use of middleware. Currently, if a user wants to look up their ranked data, they would have to first call summoner, get that encrypted summoner ID, and then call ranked. That's not that efficient for our users, and it's something that we can solve using middleware. So rather than have summoner parser return an object directly back to the user, let's convert this to middleware, where it updates the request and then returns next so that the next method can work. We can instead append to the request a summoner object. So instead of data, we get summoner. And now we say next. So now the next value or the next function after summoner parser will have request.summoner as an object it can look at. Now we have this as middleware, it's not returning anything, so let's get rid of this. But before that, let's actually put this as middleware for our ranked API. And instead of summoner ID, we go back to summoner name equals I have cute dogs. What it'll do is it'll look up my summoner name, it'll attach my summoner information to the request, and then it'll pass off to ranked lookup detail. So instead of in here, ranked lookup detail needing to look on the request for the summoner ID, we can actually just look at the summoner object. And then the query for the region, obviously. So now instead of this, it's request.summoner.id. And just to play it safe, let's look at our summoner table, and it does have ID as its object. So now, if I were to rerun this, I can call ranked with my summoner name of I have cute dogs, and it'll actually just look up on my request my summoner ID from this name, and it still takes 5 milliseconds. So it looks up against the MongoDB, gets the summoner ID, takes that summoner ID, and then looks it up against the ranked database to pull the ranked data. And that's perfect. So now we have middleware in our project, and we don't need to worry about having the end user make multiple requests to get ranked data. And in our final video of this series, we'll create a custom route that encapsulates all of this and simplifies our index.js file, as well as customizes the output of the data we want to provide to our users.